Welcome to tonight's virtual meeting of the Port Phillip City Council Planning Committee. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Weelam clan of the Boonwurrung and traditional owners of the other lands we meet from today. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. Tonight's meeting is being held via the WebEx platform and streamed via Council's webcast page. Whilst we have planned for this online meeting, there always remains the risk of technical issues arising that are beyond our control. If we experience technical difficulties tonight, we will adjourn the meeting for a short time to resolve the issue. If the issue cannot be resolved and the meeting cannot continue, then we will adjourn to tomorrow evening and details will be circulated to the public as early as possible. Meeting processes have been altered via council resolution to hear all submissions from members of the public at the start of the meeting. Additionally, voting on all motions will be under division, where the chair will call upon councillors individually in rotating alphabetical order to state their vote, i.e. the Robson rotation, for those of you familiar with the Tasmanian voting system. Item number 1, apologies. Councillors, do we have any apologies? No, I believe we are all here. 2, minutes of previous meetings. Councillors, the minutes of the ordinary meeting held on 26th of February 2020 have been circulated. Are there any questions regarding these minutes? If not, can I have a motion to confirm these minutes?
I'm happy to move the motion, Chair.
I think we've got Councillor Voss has beaten you to move the motion, Councillor Pearl to second. I will now put the motion under division. I call upon each councillor for your vote. Councillor Baxter.
4.
Councillor Bond. 4. Councillor Brand.
4.
Councillor Copsey.
4.
Councillor Crawford. Councillor Crawford.
I don't know what's happening. Oh, it keeps not working. Sorry. 4.
Thank you. Councillor Gross.
4.
Councillor Pearl. 4. Councillor Simic.
4.
Councillor Voss.
4.
The motion is carried unanimously. Item 3, declarations of conflict of interest. Does anyone have a conflict of interest in a matter being discussed at tonight's meeting? There being none, we shall proceed on. 4, public question time and submissions. We will now hear all submissions and comments on report items from members of the public. All requests to speak were required to be submitted by 4 p.m. this afternoon. At the time of registering to speak, submitters were given the option to join the WebEx meeting virtually and ask their question live during the meeting, or have an officer read their statement on their behalf. Statements submitted by members of the public will be read by the Coordinator of Governance. I call upon Stephen Kirby to address Council.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kirby has not arrived online at this stage. We will endeavour to contact him, but if you'd like to call the next speaker in line.
All right. I call upon the representatives of the First Church of Christ, the Scientist in Melbourne. Speaking to item 7.1, 217-2019, 11 to 17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, a 20-storey tower dwelling and retail proposal.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
Just
Yes.
start off by stating your name and then go into your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, my name is William Coronado. I represent the First Church of Christ Scientists in Melbourne. And this is regarding, yes, the plumbing permit for the 1117 Dorcas Street. So we have a few concerns. Number one, after having read what the council has published concerning this application, we need to ask the question, how can the council ensure that the right to free parking for 8 church workers is maintained if Middleton Lane is closed during construction and therefore access to the church car park is impossible? Item number 2. After the above, we need to say, given that the proposed building is going to occupy some of the airspace above Middleton Lane, how can the council ensure that this new building does not overwhelm the aesthetics of nearby buildings, including the next door Heritage Council of Victoria listed building of significance, First Church of Christ Scientist, Melbourne? Yes, I believe there is another member of our church also in the audience, Peter.
Yes, that's correct. I think you can probably hear me now, councillors. Is it right?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Are you responding to those questions straight away, please, Mr. Chairman?
I believe an officer will take those questions once you've finished your submission.
Okay. You asked for questions, so there are 2 more. My name is Peter Julian. William is the chairman of the board of the church adjoining next door to the property in question, and I am a board member of the church. So I have 2 additional questions on behalf of the board, and the first one is, does the council genuinely believe that allowing a building to encroach into the airspace above a public lane is in accordance with the maintenance of equity for all and the maintenance of the public amenity provided by public spaces such as Middleton Lane itself? Last question. Parking provision for church attendees is already strained when we hold weekly services on Sunday morning and evening and Wednesday evening. We have run these meetings and services for the last 100 years, non-stop, except for the last month or 6 weeks. The probable use of street parking by residents, tenants, visitors and customers of the proposed development will likely further exacerbate the current situation. What are your plans to safeguard convenient parking, not only for the church community, but for the neighbourhood? Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask the question, councillors.
Thank you, Mr. Coronellis and Mr. Julian. Mr. Board, would you kindly answer the 4 questions that were asked?
Okay, through you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the questions asked, the first matter refers to the development permits process if a permit is issued. So that would then be how they construct on the land, and if we normally would require them to construct on the land, very rarely allow them just to move into the laneway. So that would be a discussion that would be dealt with at that point, but we can also certainly notify development permits if a permit does go through, so that Middleton Lane at that section on the east side of the subject site doesn't get closed off. So which allows then continues access. In respect of airspace above Middleton Lane, there's no airspace that's being lost in this instance. The development is occurring within its own site. The third question is very similar in terms of that discussion, and in terms of the 4th question about parking provision for church attendees, again, there will be a discussion we will have at the development permit stage to ensure that parking is not necessarily lost for particularly the workers, because they do access the rear of the church site through Middleton Lane. So again, we'll try to maintain that. In terms of there's a question about the heritage significance of the building, which hasn't come through as clearly in the statements I have before me, but the application was referred to Heritage Vic. The site of the First Church of Christ the Scientist is registered on the Victorian Heritage Register. It is a significant building on the Victorian Heritage Register, and on that basis that has been referred to Heritage Victoria, who did not have any objection to the development at the rear of the site.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. I now call upon Mr. John Tabart, speaking to item 7.1, 11 to 17, Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, 20-storey tower dwellings and retail proposal. Mr. Tabart.
My name is John Tabart. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, John. Mr. Tabart.
Thank you, Councillor. This objection's on behalf of, this statement I'm reading has been pre-circulated and is on behalf of residents who objected to the application via advertising. Bob and Sharon Talbot, David and Rosemary McGowan, John Tabart and 22 other listed objectors of the attachment for the document I've distributed, and the G12 Domain Precinct Residents Group representatives. Councillors, we, as representatives of the direct and supporting objectors to this application, provide this statement qualifying our support to the approval proposed by the officers to council consideration, item 7.1, today at the Planning Committee meeting. We concur with and support the delegates' report conditions, but we ask that further conditions in order to support this proposal. Without these specific additional amendments we're describing, we oppose the recommendation. Number one, the application proposes that the design development overlay requires a 5-metre tower setback from Dorcas Street boundary, and the application proposes this be reduced to 2.5 metres at the northeastern and northwestern corners of the tower. This facade with a concave curve in plan to only meet the 5-metre setback itself, actually at the centre of the curve, only at one point. This has impacts reducing available light and aspect to future adjacent developments and to adjacent buildings. Please see the drawing TP 109 level 6 to 9 floor plan. It shows the encroachment of 2.5 metres at the corners, northeastern and northwestern. This concession to allow the setback encroachment should be halved to 1.25 metres to average the, in fact, encroachment to zero by taking 6.25 metres setback at the centre point. This precedent concession often is used where the curved facade is considered to be an aesthetic benefit, but the applicant and the community contribute equally. So rather than giving away 2.5 metres each corner, give away 1.25 and the applicant gives away 1.25 extra setback at the centre of the curve. That's averaging, if you like, the curve to mean that the setback is maintained at 5 metres on average. An example of that precedent is the tower facade of 39 to 43 Park Street, which was permitted in the last 2 years, which has multiple curves in plan form of the tower, but was approved with the average setback encroachment of zero. In other words, the full setback is provided. The facade comes forward and also goes back. So both the applicant and the community are contributing to the curvature, etc. So the setback is maintained on average. Second item, the 1.5 metre setbacks adjacent to Middleton Lane at ground level are high enough for a truck passage from the eastern and south boundaries to Middleton Lane should be extended for the entire frontage, not for the 7 metre long proposed in this recommendation. This full length setback then allows 2 vehicle passing along the whole Middleton Lane east and south frontages, providing for the growing amount of two-way traffic in Middleton Lane, which services the First Church of Christian Science car park we just talked about, the Seasons Hotel car park at the end of Middleton Lane, and the development of adjacent sites as they are developed. This full-length setback was endorsed by the council officer in 10.1 on page 45, but not pursued by the delegate report recommendations. The adjacent properties, 19 to 25 Dorcas Street, also backing onto Middleton Lane, can also be slated in the future for the same 1.5 metre width setback for any future planning application. Note the delegate's report concludes that these three of these four properties adjacent are unlikely to be developed because of the difficulties of amalgamating the site. But in fact, three adjacent properties at 19 to 23 Dorcas, directly adjacent to the applicant property, have been listed for sale by Savills together in line from August to December last year, with expressions of interest closing on the 20th of November. So the likelihood of redevelopment is not unlikely, it is certain. Item 3, the loading bay dimensions and swept path diagrams are inconsistent in the drawing TP 103, the ground floor plan, and the traffics report, which appears to be the source of the officer's discussion on page 35 of the delegate's report, loading bay and waste collection. This loading bay version, the traffics report, does not allow residents access to the loading bay without traversing the entire length of the side and rear lanes. You've got to walk out the front door, down the side, down the rear to get to the loading dock. The TP 103 version does not appear to provide sufficient manoeuvring for space and waste removal. That's probably why the traffics model is used. But the setbacks we propose would allow additional space, also the setbacks to the lane. This loading bay confusion needs to be resolved. The recommendation appears to be about the traffics report, which allows no access to residents, whereas in fact the plans show another version, a north-south version of the loading bay, and not the one that's discussed and recommended in the application.
Mr. Tabat, we're at 5 minutes. If you could come to the conclusion of your presentation, that'd be...
I'm at the last paragraph and a bit.
Thank you.
The delegate's report advises on page 69 requiring a 1.5 metre setback for the length of the east and southern boundaries would lead to unreasonable obligation on the applicant to redesign the space. This is, on the contrary, an unreasonable burden on the community and the residents and the service operators. Planning application designs are evolutionary and should be easily varied to accommodate appropriate council requirements. Last item 4, a number of conditions required by the urban design officer to gain full support of the proposal listed on page 33 of the application have not been addressed by way of a condition in the recommendation to you. I've listed 3 of them: a comprehensive analysis of solar convergence of the concave facades, relocation of the communal open space from the south to the north, ensuring that a blank concrete wall and screening are broken up to provide high quality screening. There are others in my supporting documentation to the statement.
Thank you, Mr. Tabat. Thank you for your very thorough presentation. I call upon Lachlan Anderson, speaking to item 7.1217/2019, 11 to 17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, 20-storey tower dwellings and retail proposal.
Thank you. My name is Lachlan Anderson on behalf of Woodmarsh Architecture, further on behalf of the leader. The current design was presented at a community meeting with attended by 2 councillors and interested parties late last year. The sweeping and receding facades, fusing the podium and the tower into one form, was met with broad acceptance by those present. Beginning at the podium level, the building form pulls away from Dorcas Street and Middleton Lane in excess of the setback requirements. The podium height is derived from its heritage neighbour, whilst the form itself recedes from the boundary in a civic gesture, providing additional setback and increasing amenity. This results in a reduced footprint per level than if the tower were to be set back to the minimum requirements. At grade, the podium activates the streetscape of Dorcas Street and Middleton Lane with an offering of retail space, an abundance of planting and the opportunity for public artwork. At Council's request, the podium has been brought in along the two Middleton Lane interfaces and passing bays introduced to aid vehicle movements. Increasing the laneway width will impact the podium, reducing available area for retail, services and car parking. However, could be considered if this issue proves critical. An holistic approach has been taken to ensure a cohesive language is established between the podium and the tower elements, the sweeping curves creating a gentle transition between the two, defined by a horizontal band of glazing. Terraces at the northeast and northwest corners for the full height of the tower form increase the building's porosity, reducing the visual bulk of the building when viewed in both directions from Dorcas Street. Varying shades of glazing to each concave facade respond differently to environmental conditions and vantage points to continually shift the building's visual identity. Materiality is limited to emphasise the singular sculptural form of the building over employing a composite design language. Thank you.
Sorry, just unmute myself. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I call upon Grace Brown, the applicant, speaking to item 6.1, the petition requesting planning application 217-2019 11-17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne. We referred to the Minister for Environment, and 7.1, which is 217/2019 11-17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, the 20-storey tower dwelling and retail proposal.
Hi, thank you. My name is Grace Brown and I'm a planner from Dorcas, and we've been representing the applicant throughout the development in question. I'll start with a response to 6.1, which is the petition for this application to be referred to the Department of Environment. Thanks for providing us with the opportunity to speak tonight. To provide some background, we received a letter from the Department of Environment in February stating that the application at Dorcas Street had been raised to their attention and asking us to complete a self-assessment based on the site's proximity to Melbourne's Domain Parkland and Memorial precincts. We discussed the project with the department to understand our obligations and proceeded to undertake a self-assessment based on the recognised values of the area, the Indigenous significance and national heritage significance of the gardens and shrine. To make the assessment, we were directed to a document titled Matters of Environmental Significance, Significant Impact Guidelines, 2013. I've listed both the historic and Indigenous heritage values in our written submission, but in the essence of time, I will only refer to the historic impacts. The impacts specifically ask whether the action, being the development, will permanently remove, destroy, damage, or substantially alter the fabric of the heritage place, will extend, renovate, refurbish, or substantially alter the heritage place, permanently remove, destroy, damage, or substantially disturb archaeological deposits or artefacts, involve activities in the heritage place which will have long-term impacts on its value, involve the construction of buildings or other structures within, adjacent to, or within important sightlines of the heritage place, or will make notable changes to the layout, spaces, form, or species composition of a garden or heritage place. Based on the above assessment criteria, it is clear that the proposal will have no impact on the heritage place. The Indigenous criteria is very similar and we have come to the same response. The only point where there may be some ambiguity is in regard to the construction of buildings within, adjacent to, or within important sightlines. To this we say that the proposal is neither within or directly adjacent to the heritage place. In terms of the sightlines, the proposal is not within an important sightline, as if it was, it would be covered by the Shrine Vista controls. The amendment for the DDO 26 overlay came in recently, and if this was an issue, we would have expected that the Vista controls would have been extended to cover the site on Dorcas Street. Furthermore, the Shrine trustees have reviewed a Vista analysis for the Dorcas Street proposal and have raised no objection. Finally, it is noted that the petition presented to Council revolves around the issues of glare and overshadowing. Neither of these points are mentioned within the impacts guidelines, and so it cannot be considered that these issues would justify the referral of this application to the department, as they are not relevant. These issues are covered in the planning controls and have been appropriately responded to. Whilst not a relevant consideration for the department, we also acknowledge the concerns raised by the petitioners and just now by Mr Talbot about the glare impacts. Council's urban design team has previously proposed a condition which does not appear to have made it into the draft permit, which we are happy to incorporate. This condition requires a glare and reflectivity analysis and specifies key locations, including the Shrine of Remembrance. This condition is detailed in my written response and in the officer's report, and we hope it provides the petitioners with some comfort on this issue. So based on the above, it is not considered justified or reasonable to refer the application to the Department of Environment, and we respectfully request that Council deny this application and avoid any further delay with a decision on the proposed development. Thanks. Okay, should I just go into 7.1?
If you just go into your next submission, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so this application has been with Council for some time now, and over this time we've worked collaboratively with the Council officers to achieve what we believe is a positive design response which goes some way to addressing the objectors' concerns. As has been discussed by Lachlan and Mr Talbot, we do have a condition on the planning permit which allows a passing bay, which was one of the key concerns raised at the objectors meeting. Notwithstanding this, if this is a critical issue and Council see fit to extend the entire length of the laneway, that's something that we can definitely consider and could accept it as a permit condition. Mr Talbot also had some questions with the loading bay, and there has been some confusion of this, just given that the loading bay on the advertised plans doesn't match the traffic report and the further discussion plans that we submitted to Council. Just to clarify, the traffic report is correct, as are the discussion plans, and we have reviewed the proposal for a loading bay along with the passing bay to confirm that both of these requests can be accommodated. So to give Council some comfort on this, we have proposed another condition, which I did send through to the planning officers, but essentially we've requested that at the end of condition 1B, which relates to the passing bay, we include another condition, which is condition 1BV, to state swept path diagrams and confirmation from a qualified traffic engineer that the revised loading bay allows access and sufficient space for waste collection and loading to be completed on site. Then there was the issue of glare, which I've just mentioned in my last submission. But again, more than happy to accept a more comprehensive condition on the glare requirements. At page 37 of the officer's report, the urban designers do request a condition which covers the Shrine of Remembrance, the north side of Dorcas Street, and the corner of St Kilda Road and Government House. And it's a glare reflectivity and modelling analysis which looks at heat, glare and radiation, and will ensure that the development does not create any inappropriate conditions. So this condition has also been discussed with the Shrine trustees and they haven't raised any concerns. Another issue that we understand to still be outstanding or in question is the issue of the floor-to-floor heights within the podium levels of the car park. Whilst they're not 3.5 metres, as described in GDO 26, the intention of this requirement is to allow car parks to be retrofitted for alternate uses should they become redundant. As shown in the section diagrams in the architectural package, the floor-to-floor heights of the car park are the same as the adjacent residential uses. This means that they will allow the capacity to be retrofitted to residential apartments of a similar amenity should it come about that the car parking is no longer required. Just looking at, in terms of Mr. Talbot's other questions, the last one was really on that 5 metre setback from the north side of the north side of the property. And as Lachlan has described, the architecture of the building does require this curved sort of shape, which pulls back from the street. So while we do encroach within the 5 metres at that section, the building is curved, and it's not like it's an NLA grab because the podium also pulls back. So sort of create that architectural integrity. So it is our preference that further setbacks are not required at this point. So on the whole, we believe that this proposal presents an interesting and high-quality architectural design response. The proposal complies with all the requirements in the planning scheme with regards to the shrine and surrounding environment and provides an apartment building which will add to the vibrancy of South Melbourne. Where the proposal varies from DDO 26, it retains an appropriate design response which ensures no adverse amenity impacts or equitable development impacts. Based on the above, we respectfully request that councillors uphold the officer's recommendation to support the application. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Brown. One of our councillors has a question for the applicant, and I understand that Mr Anderson is going to be answering questions on your behalf. So is Mr Anderson still on the line? And if so, Councillor Voss, are you able to ask your question and then we'll go to Mr Anderson for an answer?
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to ask some questions. I have two, one which I believe has been answered, and that was in relation to you accepting a condition for the full length of the lane to be set back an additional 1.5 metres for the ground floor and the first floor. So thank you very much for that. The second part of the question is in relation to the pool and the open space, and I was wondering why it was decided that to locate that on the south side of the building.
Councillor, the intention was for Grace Brown from Urbis to answer further questions. So if it's possible to direct that to her, that would be great.
Yes, is...
Hi.
You're still on the line, that's fine, you're still there. Yes, if you could answer that question.
No problem. We did receive the comments from the urban designer about potentially relocating the pool to the northern side. We didn't sort of see that as necessary because the pool's indoor, so I don't think that sort of access to sunlight will make too much of a difference in that respect. The reason that it is located towards the south is just to maximise the amenity, the north-facing amenity of those apartments. Also allows improved passive surveillance onto the street rather than having a pool which probably isn't used quite as much on that side. So that's really it.
Thank you, Ms Brown. And thank you both, Ms Brown and Mr Anderson, for your submissions. We have received one further submission to be read out on behalf of members of the public by the Manager of Governance at the City of Port Phillip.
Through you, Mr Chairman, it's George Borg here.
Thank you, Mr Borg. If you could read that out.
Happy to read it out. We have a letter from Miriam Wiley, and in her letter she says, I previously lodged an objection to the above application and understand that the application will be determined at the council meeting scheduled for this Wednesday, 27th May 2020. Having reviewed the council officer assessment of the proposal, I wish to stress that the proposed condition dealing with Middleton Lane traffic, proposed condition 1B, is considered inadequate and the proposal should not be approved before Middleton Lane traffic has been appropriately resolved. There are already significant access issues associated with the fact that Middleton Lane caters for one-way traffic only, with vehicles often propping at Dorcas Street to allow vehicles within Middleton Lane to exit. Further conflict due to increased vehicle movements associated with the proposed development is unacceptable, and I strongly seek a holistic solution by Council to address two-way traffic within the eastern and southern arms of Middleton Lane before the proposal is approved. Alternatively, should the councils vote to approve the proposal this week, there is concern that the existing setback currently shown for the vehicle access and loading bay will be used to satisfy proposed condition 1B for a passing bay. This will lead to further conflict with vehicles entering and exiting and unloading within the site. The proposed condition should therefore be amended to ensure that the passing bay is provided to the east of the loading zone and the services rooms reconfigured accordingly. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Borg. I believe we're still waiting for Mr Kirby to join us. Is Mr Kirby joined us as yet?
Through you, Mr Chair. No, he hasn't, but I am happy to read a statement submitted on his behalf. So the question submitted for public question time by Stephen Kirby states, I am an owner of a property on Ingle Street, Port Melbourne since 2011. The building is deemed Extreme Heritage Overlay, originally constructed in 1900 as a bakery. The proposed extension at 110 Ingle Street is the single greatest change to this landscape in 120 years and overshadows my private courtyard from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m, as well as my kitchen's glass ceiling. Being my private living space receives less than 5 hours direct sunlight, why has Council permitted a building to further overshadow it and not in compliance of A14 of the Building Code? Will Council address this urgently?
Thank you for reading that out for us. And that concludes our questions. Unless, Mr. Borg, are you able to answer that last question, or should we take that on notice?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'll answer the last part of that question because the first part's quite complex and we don't have plans that we would normally go through. But I will say that we are dealing with the matter urgently because there is a meeting lined up tomorrow with the coordinator of Gateway, the planning coordinator and the principal planner going out to meet with Mr. Kirby on site. So I apologise on that. It's going to be meeting virtually, but they'll be discussing the matter with Mr. Kirby.
Not a problem. Thank you, Mr. Borg. And that concludes public question time and submissions. Item 5 on the agenda, councillor question time. Councillors, do we have any questions of the officers? Councillor Voss.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I'd just like to note that it's been quite some time since we've had a planning meeting. Are you able, maybe Ms. Rosick or Mr. Borg, to outline why that's been the case and what we've been doing in the meantime to address any planning issues?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to speak in relation to that. We did have a meeting at the Port Melbourne Town Hall last month, from my recollection, where we did go through 2 items and have dealt with those. But what we've been doing in the interim is still dealing with applications and considering them. Not all have been required to be reported to Council, so we've dealt with the delegation that Council has provided us. And yes, we're still dealing with applications, as you'll see in the next item, or the second last item, which is in regard to the delegation report, which identifies the decisions made by officers under delegation.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Pearl, I believe you have a question.
Thanks very much. My question is also for Mr. Borg. Mr. Borg, there was a recent publicity in the Herald Sun and the Age advising that the planning minister is intending to bring forward planning approvals for economic stimulus in the city of Melbourne and the Docklands region. I was wondering if you're aware of any plans to do a similar thing, particularly in the Fisherman's Bend precinct or in and around the St Kilda Road precinct.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm certainly familiar with the statement put out by the Minister. We are also looking at some applications, whether they are shovel ready, but that's what the question that's been put to us. I believe Councillor Rosick has been to one of those meetings, so I think she'd be even better placed than me to provide a response to you on this matter.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Ms. Rosick.
Great. So just adding to Mr. Borg's comments, the Victorian Government has established a task force and the IMAP councils, including the City of Port Phillip, have been invited to meetings to discuss opportunities to fast-track shovel-ready planning applications. So council officers are reviewing those opportunities. We have also identified opportunities across the city in regards to stimulating development in certain activity centres, such as potentially Fitzroy Street and South Melbourne. We're currently working through those, and we're going to be speaking with the state government about those and then presenting that information to councillors. there's an opportunity to meet the economic and social needs and activate places for the benefit of the community, and council officers and council wants to make the best opportunity we can of any funding that may be available or any opportunities to fast track planning.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms Rossi. Councillors, there being no further questions, I shall move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 6, petitions and joint letters. Councillors, we have one petition on tonight's agenda. 6.1, petition requesting planning application 217-2019, 11 to 17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, be referred to the Minister for Environment. Councillors, are there any questions to officers in relation to this report? There being none.
Yes, sorry. Can I ask a question to an officer?
You could use the chat room just to indicate you have a question, but go ahead, Councillor Grant.
You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry I didn't do that. I'd just like to ask an officer. This petition requests the planning application to be referred to the Minister for Environment, but are there other ways of this question being answered other than being referred to the Minister for Environment that may satisfy these petitioners or may satisfy council, that we've satisfied it? I'm just wanting to put the referral to the Minister for Environment in some sort of context.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Borg or Mr. Borg or Ms Rosic, if one of you is able to take that question.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for elevating me.
On
my stand, yes. No, there isn't. In terms of meeting the legislation, Councillor Brand, there isn't another way of doing it. The obligation, again, is not on council. The obligation is on the applicant, as Ms Brown has indicated, in terms of providing this information. Now, we're satisfied that it doesn't need to be referred as officers, because when you look at the shadow diagrams, there's no impact. There's already a 20-storey building opposite the subject site. We've also spoken to the City of Melbourne, who would have a lot more dealings on these matters, and they've said the same thing as us, and there's nothing in our current planning schemes that would trigger such a requirement. They would do and act exactly as we are doing, and don't believe it would need to be referred. So we've had that discussion with them as well, and they would be the committee of management for that site also.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillors, are there any other questions? There being none, councillors, we have an officer's recommendation. Would someone like to move this or something different? Moved by Councillor Voss. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Pearl. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say I really appreciate that this has been brought to us as a petition, and I want to acknowledge the work that the petitioner has done in their research. It is really important that we consider any impacts on the shrine, and we do. This is a constant issue that comes up, and we make sure that our view lines and our overshadowing on any of our buildings don't impact the shrine. So I feel confident in this that we are doing the right thing, and that the shrine won't be impacted. So fully support the officer's recommendation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Councillor Pearl, would you like to speak to the item?
Encourage all councillors to obviously vote for this motion. The shrine is sacred territory. We all respect that. And if you respect it, I'd strongly suggest that you support this officer's recommendation. Look forward to us here this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Would any other councillor like to speak to the motion? There being no other speakers, Councillor Voss, would you like to close?
No, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillors, I will now put the motion under division and call upon each councillor for your vote. Under the Robson rotation system, the first councillor on the list is Councillor Bond, and I am voting for. Councillor Brand?
For.
Councillor Copsey?
For.
Councillor Crawford?
Again, for.
Councillor Gross?
For.
Councillor Pearl?
For.
Councillor Simic?
For.
Councillor Voss?
For.
And Councillor Baxter?
For.
The motion is carried unanimously. Councillors, we now move to item number 7 on the agenda, presentation of reports. For each, we have one report on the agenda tonight. Actually, no, we have 3 reports on the agenda tonight. The first item on the agenda is item 7.1, which is 217/2019, 11 to 17 Dorcas Street, South Melbourne, the 20-storey tower dwellings and retail proposal. Councillors, do we have any questions of the officers on this proposal? Councillor Voss, you have a question for the officers.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just want to take up the First Church of Christ's questions again, in that the car park that they have there on Middleton Lane during construction, I anticipate will not be available to them. Are you able to confirm whether that will or will not be the case, or is that outside the planning, what we can do?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Borg here. It is outside of the planning realms, but predominantly when construction does occur, we encourage them to develop within their site. So, and we don't, because it's such an important laneway, there may be occasions where the laneway could be closed for bringing material on or concrete pours, potentially, but this site also does have good street frontage along Dorcas, so it certainly should be able to be accommodated at that point. What we do at the development permit stage, we also have a pre-application meeting on significant sites like this with the builder, and we will talk to them through some of the concerns of residents as well. So I've noted those, and I'll pass them on to the coordinator of city permits.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. I guess the Seasons Hotel would also have an issue around that, given that's their public car park. I have a further question, Councillor.
Yes, Councillor Voss, you can go ahead with your second question.
Thank you. Both the chair and a board member of that First Church of Christ mentioned airspace being encroached. That was addressed by you before. In fact, you said that there wasn't any. I'm just wondering why they would think that there was any encroachment over the airspace on Middleton Lane.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm unclear on that. I would think that it's maybe a reference to development equity in terms of, making sure that people develop in accordance, essentially, the way we've tried to require them to do through the DDO. That's the only thing I can think of, because the site as itself, in fact, in parts actually comes in from the boundaries. If you can see, certainly on parts of the west elevation, on the southern elevation, they actually don't use up all their site. So it's because of the curvilinear nature of the design. So no, I'm unclear on that, but certainly we've rechecked that based on this question that was put to us, and all the development seems to appear to be within the title boundaries, and we wouldn't allow things to overhang right-of-ways, etc., unless there was a licence arrangement with council.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Pearl, you had a question.
Thanks very much. I had the great pleasure of chairing the consultation meeting between the applicant and some of the objectors or otherwise on this matter. I was just wondering what changes to the application, if any, have been made since that consultation meeting when most of the residents' concerns have been raised. Has the applicant changed their designs at all?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, no, there's been no changes to the design, and there have been discussion plans circulated, but they don't have any standing. And so we have considered the matter based on the advertised plans. Some of the discussion plans that were provided were inconclusive in terms of how they were trying to arrange some of the car parking areas, and so they were trying to arrange the loading. So we have taken it based on what's before us, though my understanding and listening to Ms Brown was that they would be certainly far more accommodating in terms of providing some access around the property, and instead of having the passing lane as recommended by officers, it appears that they would accept that there'd be a 1.5 metre inset into their property, which would make the laneway width around 5.5 metres.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Brand, you had a question.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Borg on the issue of the setback of mainly the front facade or the front of the building. That Mr. Tabat outlined what seems like a very reasonable way of handling the average setback of the unusually curvy building compared to our normal rectilinear setback sort of diagram, saying that that 2.5 metre setback should be perhaps shared by half by the community and half by the developer, and it should be set back a further 1.5 metres. Can you? It's very, very hard to understand the actual geometry of it, and also the regulatory context that it's in, like the balconies that stick out past it. Are they actually counted as part of the envelope or not? And what sort of reasons we might have allowed a dispensation? Just to put that nice simple formula that he put to us into some sort of context of discretionary decision making.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Councillor Brand. I will ask Mr. Parkinson to provide a response to that question.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's Scott Parkinson here, the coordinator for the Gateway team. In this area, there's a podium tower discretionary requirement, but the context is quite mixed in the area. So the design response has been proposed as something that's considered a innovative approach to recognise the podium tower form. In regard to additional setbacks, Council's gone through its referral processes to strategic planning and also the urban design, and the design is something that's met with some support. It's also done a full assessment of the proposal. Any further changes it's unclear how that would affect the proposal that's been before Council, what sort of impact it would have on internal amenity and other issues. Council officers in their position are comfortable with the design as innovative, and it'll be something that will be a good addition to that streetscape while meeting the requirements of the design, development and overlay provisions.
Can I just ask a further question to that?
And Councillor Brand.
Why would we be worried about the problems that it causes the developer in the internal impacts of it? I mean, every envelope that we impose anywhere will have impacts on internal amenity. Is it just that we've left it so late, or I don't understand what that particular problem is? I'm looking for other reasons for allowing it, other than the fact that they might have trouble cramming everything into the envelope if it changed.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we just haven't assessed what that change is in terms of what impact that would have on the design of the building and for the different layouts of the apartments and how the configuration of the development would be.
Can I add through you, Mr. Chairman, as well, that thank you. I understand Mr. Tabat's position, and that is a valid position in terms of an option and an alternative. What we have before us is really the application as we need to see it, and we've had it referred to our urban designers and had it referred to our strategic planners, who are very sympathetic of and supportive of the design as it's been put. They believe it provides an appropriate variation to the DDO.
Mr. Borg, can you speak up a little bit? I'm sorry, I'm finding it hard to hear.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, good.
Loud and clear.
So the variations that have been proposed are very well supported by Council's urban designer and our strategic planners. We think it does provide an appropriate balance in terms of what the DDO requires, its location, and it's also its context. So opposite the site on the City of Melbourne side, you have 3 buildings in front of it. One is a 20-storey building, which pretty much is straight up. you have an 8-storey building, which very much is straight up. To the west of that, closer to Wells Street, you have a situation where you have a podium, but it's not really clearly defined. That podium seems to be more of a cover to widen out the amount of car parking that can be achieved there, because it looks like it's screened car parking at that location. So in this context, different to some of the other contexts we have in DDO 26, this provides, we think, a balanced outcome in terms of the DDO requirements, the setbacks, the provisions. And the only other concern I'd have with Mr. DeBart's approach is that the apex of that concave, I think, may create a greater problem in terms of solar reflectivity, because it'll be a lot more concentrated at that point. So that's probably a question we'd need to assess that anyway. We're looking at assessing that as part of a condition that we've proposed as an alt motion by officers. So it's certainly a discussion that could be had, and it could be checked and tested, but we think the proposal as submitted is supportable.
There's a part of my question that wasn't answered. Well, could I rephrase it? Do you think that the balconies need to be counted as part of the overall facade, or are they not part of it?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Councillor Brand, for clarifying. The question that you're asking is that the way the balconies are designed, they integrate into the building. So they integrate as part of that building, and the setbacks under the DDO allow for encroachments of balconies at that point. Now, this is not your normal rectilinear design, so it would provide for a different outcome if that was the case and they were forward, and we've been strong in some parts where that hasn't been a traditional element. So in this case, it has that benefit of being part of the architectural feature, part of the architectural design, and also provides passive surveillance of the street. So there is discretionary setbacks allowable, and encroachments, and balconies can form part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Voss, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two questions. One, it relates to the Bluestone laneway. It's quite a beautiful laneway, very straight, not bumpy at all compared to most of our laneways. So given that one of the conditions we're looking at putting on this is to increase the width of the laneway 1.5 metres additional, what's going to happen there? Will that be up to the applicant and how that looks? Just wondering, in terms of continuity.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that question, Councillor Voss. We haven't turned our mind to the actual materials that would be there. We would probably not replicate the bluestone into that area. We'd probably have a separation. The beauty of having a separation is also provides some clear visual cues for people to know that this is wider and it can be used for a passing bay rather than the traditional carriageway component. So, but that's something we'll work through. That'll be part of the conditions we talk about, materials, etc.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Voss, you've got a follow-up question?
There's a couple of, well, there's an alternative officer's recommendation, and I think Councillor Pearl and myself also have an alternate motion which both lists a new condition 22. It says, to control solar reflectivity and glare from the building. I'm wondering, is that enough in the sentence? It's quite brief, or is there more to that particular item?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Councillor Voss. No, that is the condition. We think it's a catch-all condition. We know it's a condition used by the Department of Planning, and we have spoken to them, so that seems to be enough to support any enforcement required and also be clear and certain in terms of what the expectations are. So the applicant has offered an alternate condition, an additional one, which we can certainly have a look at, but that's only been provided now. We looked at the condition we had for 1F, and we were able to receive some additional information. So as an alternate officer recommendation, we've decided to remove condition 1F and replace it with condition 22, which we think would be sufficient, but the applicant certainly indicated they prepare we'd be prepared to accept a more detailed condition, which we can read out. And if council wishes to include that, we can see if we can incorporate that into the approval.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillor Voss, you've got another question?
One last question for me, thank you, Chair. It's around the DDO and in particular the height. The applicant has gone for the maximum possible, being the full height requirement. Do we have any sort of, if I could put it like this, quid quo pro here? They've gone for the maximum. Are they fulfilling all their obligations under the mandatory and our preference under the discretionary requirements of the DDO?
Mr. Borg?
Or
Through you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for that question, Councillor Voss. The question about maximising heights has been one that's been tested before the tribunal on a number of occasions, particularly in this precinct. The tribunal has indicated if the controls allow for that, there's no reason why it shouldn't occur. What we will always try to do is make sure that the objectives are met before we would encourage that provision. We believe, based on the quality of the design, the fact that they've been offering to give something back, the fact that they've set in different parts, met all the requirements of the controls, we think it's appropriate to allow them to go to that height. Councillor, I've also understand that Mr. Parkinson wants to add to my response.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The other issue that normally comes up, which is a discretionary control, is the side setbacks of the building from the laneway for adjacent property, particularly for equitable development. This is not an issue that's been brought up, but the proposal quite clearly meets those setbacks, which is different from a lot of other applications. So the tower form has the 4.5 metre setback from the side and rear boundaries in accordance with other applications that have been supported by the Tribunal and Council. So that's another reason why this is supports that part of the proposal. Also like to note that regarding the height, there is a condition of the permit as well to ensure the building would not exceed its maximum height as well, just to cover that it will be no bigger than what the DDO allows.
Thank you, Mr. Parkinson. Councillors, are there any other questions? Councillor Brand.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, could I ask an officer, perhaps Mr. Borg, where the proposal to widen the whole lane, which is an alternative recommendation, but I think it comes from a standard approach, to widen the whole lane by 1.5 metres. Where does that 1.5 metres come from? Why on this lane?
Through you.
Go ahead, Mr. Borg.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. That was a discussion that was held with the traffic engineers. The traffic engineers identified that 6 metres would be the ideal width for a carriageway to allow for vehicles to pass each other in opposite directions. Officers looked at what was available and anticipate that there's going to be further development on the site. I know that the properties next door, Mr. DeBar kindly told us that those properties are up for sale. What is going to occur on that is still speculative at the moment, so we can't guarantee that, but we know that the objectives of the controls identify that there's going to be some future development. So that's where we've started talking to council's traffic engineers and what could be acceptable and how we could actually make it work without creating too much of an impost. And again, achieving a balance between getting a good traffic outcome as well as maintaining a good development outcome. And the traffic engineers came back with a passing bay provision of around 5.5 metres with a length of 7 metres. So if you set back the building 5.5 metres, you don't need the length of 7 metres, and that would still create a sufficient passing bay. It's a slow speed landscape through the laneways. I've travelled there again this morning, and while comfortable, it is a slow speed. It's quite wide as it is now, and so I think with the extra 1.5 metres, it would certainly make it easy to get through, and that's the basis of the 1.5 additional was based on the advice of council's traffic engineers.
Is there no chance of the buildings on the other side of the lane being redeveloped in the coming decades, do you think?
No, I would anticipate, well, again, the COVID scenario has made things very different, but this is an area that's earmarked for higher density. So it's an area that we as council and state government have recognised as an area for higher density. So yes, I would anticipate additional development in that location. It's not a large block, so there's about 5 properties by the time you get from this site to Wells Street. So then it creates a natural separation. So
I'm just thinking, if the lane, if the ideal width of a lane in this making it a two-way lane would be 6 metres. Ideally, you'd take 1 metre off one side and 1 metre. This is a 4 metre wide lane.
Yes.
You take 1 metre off each side, but if you did that, you'd be waiting for the other side to redevelop. And would 5 metres be too narrow for a 2-lane? I mean, if you just took 1 metre off, would that would leave you with 5 metres until one day that the other side might put another metre on. Yes. But I'm just wondering, would that make it a possible 2-way lane or not at 5 metres?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, that would make it more equitable, absolutely. However, we need to deal with the application before us. We also noting that the church to the east of the site has a significant Victorian heritage listing on it, and it's unlikely that would be developed in this same sort of way. So the applicants have offered in this instance, and this is not a planning scheme requirement. The council's traffic engineers were very clear that 4 metres, as it sits now, would operate and still work successfully based on the traffic volumes.
It's a one-way lane.
It's actually not a one-way lane, and that is incorrect in terms of the statement that one of the speakers provided earlier that I did read out. It's actually not a one-way lane, it's a 2-way lane, and you can travel in either direction. So what it does do, though, with the additional width, at this point, we've been able to negotiate with the applicant. The applicant was also quite prepared to accept the condition in regard to the passing lane. So, and now they've indicated, as you've heard from Ms Brown, that she'd accept a condition that goes all the way down the east and south elevation, which would be very helpful. And if a development does come through on the neighbouring properties, we would endeavour to negotiate an appropriate outcome there as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Councillors, are there any other questions? There being none, councillors, we have an alternate recommendation from the officers. Mr. Ball, can you just briefly outline the changes from the alternate recommendation to the recommendation that was previously put forward by officers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I will. So this one is identified that we have deleted condition F and replaced that with condition 22 through, and we've also, there was a duplication of condition 22 and condition 19, so we've deleted the former condition 22, which is parking loading areas, and we've replaced that with the glare condition. And we also replaced, I apologise, I've jumped ahead of myself here, condition 1S we've added to. We've talked about the colour of schedule and materials, colours and finishes to be used on the proposed building, with details of the glare and solar reflectivity of the materials. So that's identified and will be read in conjunction with condition 22. So we've identified that is a way of describing it in the plans, so we can control that. Condition X now reads, condition X now reads that it should be the development does not exceed 70 metres AHG in the height above the natural ground level. That is what's prescribed in the design development overlay. So we've deleted the other references. So the strikeout sections are the deletions. I'm just making sure I haven't missed anything, Mr. Chairman. Condition 22 was that one where we replaced with where we've indicated that in terms of glare, external building materials and finishes must not result in hazardous or uncomfortable solar reflectivity and glare to pedestrians, public transport operators and commuters, motorists, aircraft or occupants of surrounding buildings and public spaces to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. Now that is an all-encompassing condition, Mr. Chairman, that should cover pretty much every aspect and again has been tried and tested by the department.
Thank you, Mr. Borg. Councillors, do we have a mover for the alternate recommendation or for an alternate recommendation? Councillor Voss, you're moving the alternate recommendation?
I would like to, move an alternate recommendation.
This is the alternate recommendation. Have you got an alternate motion?
Yes, an alternate motion. So it's what Mr. Borg also read out with the addition of one item. So it's replace condition 1B, passing bays, for a new condition. And those words are the ground and first floor of the building set back 1.5 metres from the southern and eastern boundary, Middleton Lane.
And that is the only change to the alternate recommendation from the officers?
Yes, according to my sheet, that's the only change I wanted to make. I'm assuming all the others are in.
So, thank you, Councillor Voss. Councillors, do we have a seconder for Councillor Voss's alternate motion? Councillor Pearl's waving his hand in the air. Councillor Pearl to second.
Just before you move on, Chair, could you just ask or through the Chair, could we just have a look at the wording of 1X? Could you just go to 1X in the...
Could we just scroll down to condition 1X? Thank you.
And whilst we do that, I'm happy for the mover to get started, if that's good.
Councillor Voss, you have a second if you would like to speak to your motion, if you choose to.
Thanks very much, Chair. This is quite an exciting development. Just to summarise, first of all, it's a 20-storey development, 58 apartments. It has a diversity in size of apartment and mix, but we have had 137 objections, and Councillor Pearl chaired a meeting with some of the objectors and the applicants, in which it was made very clear what they were. These changes with the officer's conditions, I think, go most of the way, almost 100% of the way, in addressing all of those concerns. Sorry?
Sorry.
This is quite an innovative design, and it really is a play on the podium tower type, and I'm quite looking forward to it being developed. It has things in it that we're quite keen to see, such as loading bays, such as visitor parking in the conditions. The solar convergence analysis, as per the strategic planner's requirements, is a new condition also. It does meet the DDO requirements, and as I think we've heard tonight, we are being lenient here on a number of items, for example, the setback discretionary components to the front of it. And I think there needs to be a little bit of give and take from the community and to the community. So I really appreciate the applicant agreeing to the condition which I mentioned earlier on, replacing the passing bays and having the building set back 1.5 metres from the southern and eastern boundary to Middleton Lane. I think it'll make an enormous difference. This Middleton Lane is a lovely flat blue stone laneway which runs from Wells to Dorcas Street, and it's a really important connector to many buildings that have rear entries along the laneway, such as the Four Seasons and the First Church of Christian Science. So I believe that the setback for the ground floor and the second storey, it needs to be pursued here, and then after that it can overhang back over until it's at the edge of its tidal boundary. It really is important that two vehicles can pass each other quite comfortably along this particular laneway. It does need to take into account the other buildings and businesses within that area, and I think this change of the laneway will do so. The congestion in this laneway is only going to increase, and I think we need to be on top of this, and that's what this amendment changes. My expectations is that the adjacent sites need to be required to do the same thing in their future planning applications. This is an opportunity not to be missed. It won't come back again. Our obligation is to ensure that there is a fair amenity and benefit for the community, and this building does push the planning scheme and the building to the boundaries of the site. And so I'm really keen to only allow the maximum height, obviously, as we are. It does pretty much cover the whole site. But in this case, we also need, to give back, and that's where this 1.5 metres to balance the site along the eastern and southern boundaries comes into play. I'd really like to thank the officers. The conditions have been carefully crafted and thought through, and to take into account most of the urban designers, strategic planners, traffic concerns, and the councillors' concerns, and not to forget our community that have discussed this at length. So I'm really pleased to see this building go ahead with these amendments, and I would really welcome the addition to our municipality, and I'd ask you all to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Councillor Pearl, would you like to speak to the alternate motion?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Voss, for moving the amendments. As they've done, quite a lot of work has gone into this by councillors and council officers over several months. We had a good, constructive consultation meeting several months ago now, and I'm a little disappointed that some more alteration wasn't made to the plans as a result of that consultation. This project is set amongst a community which is very proactive and constructive in their criticisms and objectives of this development. Generally speaking, the overall design concept of the building is very well supported by myself and I know the community members. The intention of these amendments, councillors, is to pick up some small aspects of the building which I'm sure aren't immaterial from the developer's point of view, but should these amendments be adopted, they'll have a substantial effect on the overall outcome for the area, the amenity of this building, and the future community that will live in this building and around this building. So I strongly suggest and hope that you support these amendments as we put here this evening. They're not half-baked, they haven't been thought up today. They come from deep-level consultation with the developer, the applicant rather, and also the objectives and the broader community. They're well thought through, and I would strongly suggest you support them, and I'm very eager and happy to support them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Councillor Copsey, you had a clarifying question.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to clarify if it was the mover's intention, there's a further alternate condition in these in this motion relating to the 5 metre average setback. I don't remember the precise wording. I wanted to clarify if it was the mover's intention to include that or just the first change that you referred to, Councillor Voss.
Thank you. It was just the first change, Councillor Copsey, to the rear and side of the building.
Oh, okay. Can I ask a clarifying question?
Councillor Pearl, you have a clarifying question?
I actually asked the written motion on the screen to be moved to the addition of letter Y. So if we could scroll to 1Y perhaps. So just so we're clear, Councillor Voss through the chair, you're suggesting that 1Y is not included in your motion? I seconded on the basis it was there as read on the screen.
Sorry, I didn't see that go in. No, I did it based upon the document that was drafted by this afternoon and sent through. So, no. Sorry, Councillor Pearl. Maybe you could move an amendment.
Perhaps through the chair, I'm happy to move the...
I don't think you can. You've already seconded and spoken.
No, sorry, I was going to say I was happy to keep... I'd like to withdraw my second then on the basis that 1Y wasn't there.
Don't know you can. You may be able to persuade another councillor to move an amendment.
If I could put a point of order.
Yes, Councillor Copsey.
Councillor Brand used the chat to indicate he was willing to second Councillor Voss's motion.
Yes, but we're dealing with the fact that Councillor Pearl has already seconded it and spoken to it. So therefore, I don't think Councillor Pearl can speak again and withdraw his...
But point of order, the motion that's on the screen doesn't reflect what the motion that is being moved. So the information I was basing my second on isn't based on what the mover actually made.
This was on the screen at the time, I believe. This was the motion.
It was, but maybe make it up, but we need to determine if Councillor Voss actually moved 1Y.
Did an officer just clarify that Councillor Voss has moved 1Y? and that was part of the alternate motion that we've moved and seconded.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the motion on the screen is the motion that has been moved and seconded. To deal with the issue, it may be appropriate for a councillor to move an amendment to the motion that's currently on the screen.
Thank you, Ms. Pearce. That's where I was heading. First of all, Councillor Voss, are you happy with the motion on the screen?
Actually, I'm not.
Would you like 1Y removed?
I would, actually.
Or amended?
I'm prepared to move an amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. If I could just get clarity from Councillors Voss and Pearl. Councillor Voss, would you like 1Y amended?
I would like 1Y removed.
All right. Councillor Pearl, would you like 1Y removed?
No.
All right. So I guess, is anyone at this point in time, given Councillors Voss and Pearl have spoken, would anyone other councillor like to move an amendment?
Yes.
Councillor Brand, what is that amendment?
That amendment would be to delete condition Y.
1Y.
Condition 1Y. Thank you, Councillor Brand. Do we have a seconder for Councillor Brand's amendment to remove 1Y? Thank you, Councillor Crawford. We have a seconder. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to your amendment?
Yes, I like Councillor Voss, did not realise that clause was still in the alt motion, and I was assuming it wasn't there. And now that we are in this situation, I think it needs to be tested at least as to what the rest of the council thinks about that particular motion. And so we can, in a sense, consider it separately by voting on it as amendment now. I personally think that it is more of an imposition than we should make at this time, with very difficult to understand what effect it would have on the public realm, positive effect by removing it, and I think in the wider context that we are removing a lot of the site from, if we go ahead with this motion, from the ground level, that I just I can't see I can't feel like it's a fair balance to be including this particular clause in it as well.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Crawford, would you like to speak?
Can you actually hear me this time?
I can hear you loud and clear, Councillor.
Okay, I don't know. My headsets are playing up. I'm supportive of this amendment. I'm seconding it because I think allowing the space in the lane, Middleton Lane at the back, is the kind of trade-off, and I think that is important for the future of the area, for traffic, for other people and residents. And I think that it's an unfair amendment to be included in this motion, so I'm very supportive.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. Would any other councillor like to speak to the amendment? Councillor Pearl.
Thanks, Chair. I'll speak against the amendment, and well done, Councillor Copsey, who's very much earned money tonight, for clarifying that, because we could have all gone down a track that none of us, well, in some respects, weren't expecting. So thank you, Councillor Copsey. But I think this works in a flexible way to ensure that community outcome on both sides of the building is very much achieved, and that the word average provides the flexibility that the applicant can mould and shape the exterior of the building to ensure that the community gets a fantastic outcome by setting this back on average at 5 metres. And I think it's a good amendment, but I'll be voting against the amendment to remove this from the substantive motion.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Would any other councillor like to speak to the amendment? There being no further councillors wishing to speak, I shall put the amendment under division. And under the Robson rotation, Councillor Brand.
4.
Councillor Copsey.
4.
Councillor Crawford.
4.
Councillor Gross. Councillor Gross. I'll take that as abstain. Councillor Pearl.
Against.
Councillor Simic.
4.
Councillor Voss.
4.
Councillor Baxter.
4.
Councillor Bond. 4. And I'll try Councillor Gross again. 4. Thank you, Councillor Gross. The motion, the amendment is carried. We now come back to the substantial motion without clause 1Y. Councillor Voss has moved, Councillor Pearl has seconded. Would any other councillor like to speak to the substantive motion? There being
yes.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Brand.
And a signal via the chat that I wanted to speak to this.
Councillor Brand, can you speak to it?
Yes. Okay. Yes, I want to speak for this substantive motion. It's obviously a high quality building, a high quality development. It's something which in general we should be supporting in this area. It is an extremely densely packed area, full of development difficulties due to its high density and its very crowded nature. And I think I want to. Well, I'll speak about the main thing first. Is to me is to get this laneway widened, and I think it's something which is very, very hard for us to do with imposing conditions of setbacks like this. I think it's a hard row to hoe through VCAT if there are appeals and what have you. But it's something which we really, really need to do. These lanes were designed in the middle of the 19th century, where they did not predict that we would be living in massive high-rise towers and driving vehicles, which are as wide as they are. So they're just not fit for the new purpose that we have imposed upon them. And we, as the local authority, as the council, need to do all we can is to refit our streets and lanes for the purposes that they need to fulfil. And it's a delicate and difficult task, and we have to do it incrementally, bit by bit. And I really, really want this bit to be achieved, so that the next bits next to it are easier to achieve, and we can start streetscaping opportunistically to meet the future needs. It is generous, I think, of this developer to say, well, if you really want to, we can actually take that slice of land off, only up to the next 2 stories. They can develop above it. But it's really important to acknowledge that. But I will also say that everybody that lives in this future development will be thanking the developer, thanking us for achieving this, because it'll make the livability of the site so much better to have decent traffic flow, decent ability to get in and out of the building, for loading, for all sorts of things. It's just going to be a better outcome for everyone, and I think a whole lot of us are doing ourselves a favour by voting this way. I feel conscious that the arguments put forward by Mr. Tabat and all of the objectives that he represents, he put a very reasonable argument about reshaping the front profile of the building, but I just feel the the community benefit to making that change is not clear to me at all, except only in theory. I mean, it sets a sort of some sort of principle, which I think is a good principle, but I can't actually see what the material value is to the community. And there's so many different discretionary and complicated countervailing aspects to it that I just don't feel like it's warranted to come down on it and not allow the discretion that has been recommended by our urban designers and our officers who've looked at it very carefully and have come up with it. So I'm pretty happy to go ahead with that. I'm pretty happy to be as generous as possible to this building, especially, well, mainly because of the big slice that we're taking out around the bottom, which is so much for the public good and so much dependent on everybody cooperating. And that's really great. Just to the neighbours of the Christian Science Church who are worried about the aesthetic impact, I'm really happy that you're worried about the aesthetic impact. I love that as a really important thing by itself in a city that we love the aesthetics of. You have a gem of a building. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in the city. And I think the impact's going to be that behind you is going to be a very large building like everywhere else behind you is, and this is going to be one of the most beautiful of them. So, I think you'll be fine there. And for the people who are worried about the reflectivity and the what do we call it, the solar impact of the converging, I can't think what it is now. We know it. It's the death ray zapping that has happened at different buildings around the world, where there's a concave facade which has concentrated the light, the sun. I think that the effect on the domain and on the shrine is almost certain to be nothing. Looking at the plans, looking at the very shallow curve of this thing, and that's speaking as an architect, a trained architect that I am. But I agree that it needs to be checked out, and so that's part of the conditions that we voted for. That this will be checked out. That council will not pass this. Will not give final approval to this proposal until they're totally satisfied that this has been that is completely found and investigated and found to be completely safe. So that's good, and I think it really should please everybody. And if it displeases, it won't be too much of a displeasure. It'll be a great joy if we can really use this as a precedent for how we go about reshaping these rear lanes, which is so important in this area. That's what I really want to bank, and that's what I'm really pleased that we might be able to achieve tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Simic, you'd like to speak to the alternate motion. Councillor Simic, we're not able to hear you even though you're off mute. No, we can't hear you, sorry. Would any other councillor like to speak, and we'll come back to Councillor Simic if we're able to? No, we'll have one more try. Councillor Simic, if you could take yourself off mute. And
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry, there's a button I didn't know about. Thank you very much. I just very briefly, I agree with everything that's been said already. This issue's been coming to us for quite some time, and I'm glad to see that following the community consultation tonight, we've got the next steps proposed. Just want to thank everyone who's participated in the process so far. We've had a lot of communication from the community on this issue. I look forward to the next steps. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the vote.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Does any other councillor wish to speak? If not, then I'll just very quickly say I think this is actually a wonderful development. It's a very good looking building. They are large apartments, which is Too often we see tiny little apartments come to us for approval. They're actually nice, well-designed, well-planned apartments. I think, and it's a very good-looking building from the renders we see here before us. One of the items I'm always red hot on is the loading bay, and the loading bay in the proposal here looks a little bit awkward, as though it will not be entirely functional. But I think the alternate recommendation whereby we get the setbacks to Middleton Lane will add the required functionality to that loading bay to make it a usable loading bay, because in the event that we don't get this right at this point in time, you're going to have 100 or so apartments. There's going to be someone moving in and out every week from this building, and their only option is going to be to either park in the middle of Middleton Lane and block traffic, or park on the footpath, or park out the front on the middle of the roadway. So it is very important that we get these loading bays right, because the cumulative effect of not getting this right from building after building after building will go long into the future. So we need to get these right every time these come before us. And I think the setbacks to Middleton Lane are also a great outcome for the laneway, to widen that and make those laneways much more functional, and to cater for the number of people that will be using them, both as pedestrian laneways and also as car thoroughfare into the future. So if no one else wishes to speak, Councillor Voss, would you like to close?
Thank you, Chair. Not that I have any arguments to refute, but I will reiterate and say that this will be a very welcomed addition to our municipality. I'd like to thank the submitters for coming and speaking to us tonight, and also the applicant. This is a high quality building and development, and I'd just like to thank everyone for their support. In particular, the applicant, they're very generous, to accept all the conditions, and in particular the laneway widening, which I believe will benefit everyone. So I'm very, very pleased to see this go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. I will now put the motion under division. Councillor Brand.
For.
Councillor Copsey.
For.
Councillor Crawford.
For.
Councillor Gross. Councillor Pearl.
For.
Councillor Simic.
For.
Councillor Voss.
For.
Councillor Baxter.
For.
Councillor Bond. For. And Councillor Gross. No answer. I will declare the motion carried. And we move on to item 7.2, statutory planning delegations decisions for April 2020. Councillors, do we have any questions of the officers? There being no questions, do I have a mover? Councillor Simic to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Copsey to second. Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to the motion?
Just to thank the officers for all of their work. I don't believe anything more needs to be said at this stage.
Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to the motion? I'll take that as a no. Any other councillor like to speak to the motion? Councillor Simic, would you like to close? In that case, then I will put the motion under division with our Robson rotation in place. Councillor Copsey?
For.
Councillor Crawford?
For.
Councillor Gross?
For.
Councillor Pearl?
For.
Councillor Simic?
For.
Councillor Voss?
For.
Councillor Baxter?
For.
Councillor Bond? For. and Councillor Brand.
For.
I declare the motion is carried. Item 7.3 on the agenda, extension of interim heritage overlay Tiuna Grove, Elwood. Councillors, do we have any questions of the officers on this item?
No, I'm happy to move.
I'll take that as there being no questions. Do we have a mover for this, the officer's recommendation or an alternate motion? Councillor,
happy to move.
Moved. Councillor, do we have a seconder? Councillor Voss to second. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the motion?
Hold on, did I move it?
Yes, you did.
Oh, good. I didn't realise that, but I wanted to. It's an important little piece of bureaucracy to extend the interim controls because we've run out of time to get the permanent controls in there. But it is just another little part of this long saga of the Tiuna Grove addition to into the heritage scheme, and it's been a long and tortuous journey, and I'm still very, very pleased to have been a part of it. And I still look at the title, the Tiuna Grove Heritage Overlay, and feel quite proud and pleased of what was achieved. So I'm very happy to be moving it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Voss, would you like to speak to the motion?
No.
Thank you, Councillor Voss. Would any other councillor like to speak to the motion? No. In that case, then, Councillor Brand, would you like to close?
I have nobody to argue against, so no.
No. In that case, then, I put the motion under division and call upon each councillor to vote using the Robson rotation. Councillor Crawford.
For.
Councillor Gross.
For.
Councillor Pearl.
For.
Councillor Simic.
For.
Councillor Voss.
For.
Councillor Baxter.
For.
Councillor Bond. For. Councillor Brand.
For.
And Councillor Copsey.
For.
I declare the motion is carried. That's all the reports on the agenda. We're up to agenda item 8, urgent business. Councillors, do you have any items of urgent business? There being none, we shall move on to item 9, confidential items. Councillors, we have no confidential items on the agenda here tonight, in which case, there being no further business, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you all very much and have a safe trip home.